Clifford Byers, impressed by Arthur's tactical mind and attention to detail, offered him a job as a private investigator for his firm. Military planning skills translate perfectly to legal work, Clifford told him. Arthur accepted, finally finding a way to protect people using the skills he had honed in the service. Away from the toxic influence of the Vances, Maya thrived. She smiled more, laughed more, and finally became just a kid again. Clarissa visited twice a week, slowly rebuilding the trust she had shattered. She had moved into her own modest apartment and started therapy, finally doing the hard work of figuring out who she was without her parents' money. One evening in April, Arthur sat on the back porch of the Oakmont house. His phone buzzed with a text from Tony Farley. Sentencing finalized. They're headed to a maximum security facility. Justice is done, brother. Arthur leaned back, looking at the stars. For so long, he had been fueled by a cold, burning anger, focused entirely on making the Vances pay. But as he watched Maya playing in the yard, he realized that the anger was gone. It had been replaced by something he hadn't felt in 15 years. Peace. We got them, Dad, Arthur whispered to the night sky. A warm breeze rustled the trees, and for a fleeting second, he could almost feel Elias Sterling's hand on his shoulder, proud and strong. The story of the Vances was over, but for Arthur and Maya, the real story was just beginning. The arrival of spring brought more than just blooming flowers to Oakmont Street. It brought a sense of permanence that Arthur hadn't felt since he was a teenager. The house, once a drafty reminder of his father's struggles, was now a home filled with the sounds of a child's laughter and the rhythmic thumping of renovation projects. Arthur's resignation from the army was finalized in April, marking the end of one chapter and the deliberate beginning of another. He traded his dress uniform for a tool belt and an investigator's badge, finding that his ability to read people and plan logistics was exactly what Clifford Byers' law firm needed. One Saturday afternoon, Arthur was in the garage teaching Maya how to change a tire, the very same garage where Elias Sterling had taught him the same lesson 20 years earlier. Maya was focused, her small brow furrowed in concentration as she worked the lug wrench. "Why do we have to know this, Dad?" she asked, wiping a smudge of grease from her cheek. "Can't we just call a tow truck?" "You can," Arthur replied, tightening a bolt to show her the proper tension. "But it's better to be capable. Your grandpa Elias used to say that the best revenge against people who doubt you is to be strong and prove them wrong by being excellent." Maya looked up at him, her eyes bright. "Is that what we did to the Vances?" "In a way," Arthur said softly. "They thought we were people they could just push around. But they underestimated us. We showed them exactly what happens when you try to break a Sterling." Maya nodded solemnly, her small hands returning to the wrench. "I'm glad I'm a Sterling." While life on Oakmont Street moved forward, the world the Vances had built continued to disintegrate. The civil settlements were brutal and thorough. Their massive estate, the vacation villas, the luxury cars, and even Diane's prized art collection were auctioned off to the highest bidders. Every dollar was funneled back to the contractors, families, and small businesses they had defrauded over the last 15 years. In federal prison, Gregory and Diane Vance were learning the true meaning of responsibility. Stripped of their wealth, their influence, and their designer labels, they were now just two more inmates facing decades of isolation. Gregory's appeals were denied, and he was faced with the reality that he would likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. Clarissa continued her slow, painful climb toward redemption. She visited twice a week, and while the relationship with Arthur remained professional and distant, the bond with Maya was beginning to heal. She had finally stopped being Gregory Vance's daughter and was learning, for the first time, how to just be herself. On a warm evening in late May, Arthur sat on his back porch with a cold drink, watching the sunset dip below the horizon. The anger that had fueled him for months, the fire that had been lit the moment he stepped onto that cold porch in December, had finally burned out. In its place was a quiet, profound peace. He looked at the fireproof safe in the corner of his office, where the portfolio Maya had found now resided. It was no longer a weapon. It was a reminder of what they had survived and a testament to the daughter who had been brave enough to find the truth. "We did it, Dad," Arthur whispered into the quiet night air. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree in the yard. For a moment, Arthur didn't feel like a captain, or an investigator, or a whistleblower. He just felt like a son who had finally done right by his father, and a father who had done right by his daughter. The bad guys had lost, the good guys had won, and the Sterling name finally stood for exactly what it was meant to: honesty, strength, and love. Arthur stood up, stretched, and walked back inside to tuck his daughter into bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and life would remain complicated and messy. But tonight, everything was exactly as it should be. At 9 a.m., Clifford Byers called. "Have you seen the front page of the Observer's website? Oliver Hunter's article just went live." The article, titled "Empire of Fraud: How Gregory Vance Built a Fortune on Stolen Lives," was devastating. It didn't just mention the criminal charges. It told the human story. It detailed how Elias Sterling and others had been systematically hunted and destroyed. It named the politicians who had taken bribes and the bankers who had helped hide the money. By noon, the story had gone national, being picked up by major news networks. "More importantly," Clifford added, "your custody hearing just got a lot easier. A judge isn't going to award custody to grandparents facing federal racketeering charges, or a mother who left her child alone to go on vacation with them." He told Arthur that primary custody was almost a certainty now, with supervised visitation for Clarissa being the most likely outcome. Arthur sat on the porch of the Oakmont house, the same porch where his father had once sat and worried about bills he couldn't pay. For the first time in years, the weight on Arthur's shoulders felt lighter. The world was finally seeing the Vances for who they really were. "We got them, Dad," Arthur whispered to the wind. But the mission wasn't quite over. There was still a custody hearing to attend, and a wife who had to decide which side of history she wanted to be on. Arthur knew the next few days would be the final test of the Sterling name. January 3rd arrived with a heavy, gray sky that seemed to match the somber atmosphere of the courthouse. This was the day Arthur had both prepared for and dreaded: the custody hearing. He drove to the courthouse with Maya sitting quietly in the back seat, her small hands folded in her lap. She looked older than her 8 years, her face set with a quiet dignity she had inherited from the Sterling side of the family. Clifford Byers was waiting for them on the steps, his briefcase looking like a shield. "Everything is ready," Clifford said, his voice a steady anchor. "The evidence of abandonment is airtight, and given the federal charges against her parents, no judge in their right mind is going to hand Maya back to that environment." Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and floor wax. Clarissa was already there, sitting at the defense table. She looked pale, her expensive coat draped over her shoulders like a burden she could no longer carry. She didn't have her parents with her. Gregory and Diane were still in federal custody, their request for bail denied due to the flight risk posed by their offshore accounts. When she looked at Arthur, there was no fire in her eyes, only a hollow, haunting sadness. The hearing began with the judge, a stern but fair woman named Carolina Durham, reviewing the evidence Clifford had submitted. She looked over the note Diane had left, the 3 days of abandonment, and the documentation of Arthur's full cooperation with the state attorney general. Then, she turned her gaze toward Clarissa. "Mrs. Sterling," Judge Durham began, her voice echoing in the silent room, "do you contest your husband's petition for primary custody?" The room held its breath. Arthur watched Clarissa, half expecting her to fight, to pull one last trick out of the Vance playbook. But Clarissa looked at Maya, then at Arthur, and finally down at her own trembling hands. "No, Your Honor," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't. My husband is a good father. He's a better father than I've been a mother. Maya should be with him." The relief that washed over Arthur was so intense it was almost painful. The judge granted Arthur primary custody on the spot, with joint legal custody. Clarissa was granted visitation rights, but they would be supervised for the first 3 months, contingent on her participation in family counseling. It was a fair ruling, a chance for Clarissa to find herself again away from the poison of her parents' influence. Outside the courthouse, the wind was biting, but the sun was finally trying to break through the clouds. Clarissa approached them in the parking lot, her eyes red from crying. She knelt in front of Maya. "I'm so sorry, baby," she said, her voice barely audible. "For leaving you, for choosing wrong, for not being the mother you deserved. I'm gonna try to be better. I promise." Maya hugged her mother, a soft, forgiving embrace that brought more tears to Clarissa's eyes. "Are you going to keep seeing Grandma and Grandpa?" Maya asked. "No," Clarissa said firmly. "They made bad choices, and I can't be a part of that anymore. I'm making different choices from now on." She looked at Arthur and whispered a quiet thank you before walking to her car, a solitary figure finally stepping out of the Vance shadow. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal activity and personal transition. By late January, the dominoes continued to fall. Wayne Stone, the corrupt inspector, cut a deal and testified against Gregory Vance. Several city officials resigned in disgrace as the full extent of the Vance bribery network was exposed. Gregory and Deborah, realizing the evidence against them was insurmountable, both pleaded guilty to multiple counts of fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy. March 1st arrived with the promise of spring, the day of the final sentencing. Arthur and Maya drove to the courthouse once more, but this time, the gallery was packed with reporters and the other contractors Gregory had destroyed over the years. When Gregory and Diane were let in, they were wearing orange prison jumpsuits instead of their usual designer labels. They looked diminished, their haughty expressions replaced by the stark reality of their downfall. Judge Durham didn't hold back. "Mr. Hoffman, Mr. Vance, you have destroyed lives with your greed and arrogance," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "You treated people as obstacles to be removed rather than human beings with dreams. You showed no remorse for the families you ruined." She sentenced Gregory to 25 years in federal prison and Diane to 15. As the gavel fell, the room erupted in a low murmur of justice served. In the wake of the trial, Arthur made a major decision. He submitted his resignation from the Army, effective in April. He had served his country for 15 years, but now it was time to serve his daughter. He moved permanently into the house on Oakmont Street, the home his father had built. The civil settlements were finalized soon after. The massive Vance estate, their cars, their art collection, and their vacation properties were all sold at auction. The proceeds were divided among the victims Gregory had cheated. Arthur's share, representing exactly what his father had lost, came to $340,000. He didn't spend a dime of it on himself. Instead, he placed it in a trust fund for Maya's future education. Erin looked up, her gaze sharp. "Can I?" "Arthur, I can put Gregory Vance and Warren Stone away for 10 to 15 years each minimum. We're looking at RICO charges, conspiracy, and racketeering. I'll need to bring in the FBI, and likely the IRS to handle the shell corporations." She paused, her expression turning serious. "You realize what this means for you, though? You'll have to testify. This is going to get incredibly ugly. The Vances will use every cent they have left to come after you." "Let them," Arthur replied. "I have nothing to hide. But I need that agreement we talked about." Erin nodded and pulled out her laptop. Right there in the coffee shop, she drafted and printed a formal cooperation agreement. It stated clearly that Arthur Sterling was a primary cooperating witness in a major criminal investigation. It wasn't immunity, he hadn't committed a crime, but it was a vital shield for the family court. It proved he was working with the law to protect his daughter from a criminal element. "The warrant for the safe deposit box?" Arthur asked as they signed the papers. I'll have it by the end of the day, Aaron promised. We'll execute it tomorrow morning first thing, and I'll make sure the media is there. The Attorney General's office loves a win like this. Arthur's next stop was the Charlotte Observer building. He met Oliver Hunter, the young investigative journalist Tony had recommended. Oliver looked like he lived on caffeine and a desire to dismantle the city's corrupt elite. Arthur handed him a flash drive containing a curated selection of the evidence. "What is this?" Oliver asked, plugging it into his laptop. "The story of how Gregory Vance built his empire on the ruins of small contractors and stolen lives," Arthur said. "Everything is in there. Financial records, witness statements, and photos. The state attorney general moves on him tomorrow. You want the exclusive? You have until tomorrow evening to write it." Oliver's eyes widened as he scrolled through the first few files. "Why me?" "Because you're honest and you've been trying to pull this thread for years," Arthur said. "And because I want the world to know exactly who these people are. They abandoned an 8-year-old on Christmas because she was an inconvenience. Make sure that's the lead." Oliver looked up from the screen, his expression solemn. "This is Pulitzer-level material, Captain. I'll get it right. I promise." That evening, as Arthur sat in the quiet of the Oakmont house, his phone buzzed. It was Clarissa. Her voice sounded hollow, stripped of the usual Vance arrogance. "I talked to my parents," she whispered. "I told them what you said about your father. They denied everything, of course. They said you were making it up to turn me against them." "And what do you think, Clarissa?" Arthur asked. I think I've been blind," she admitted. "I found something tonight in my father's study. More documents, things he's been hiding." "Arthur, if what you're saying is true—" "It is true," Arthur interrupted. "And tomorrow the whole world is going to know. I've given law enforcement everything they need. The warrants are being served in the morning." "You're destroying my family," she said, her voice catching. "No," Arthur corrected her. "Your father destroyed families, including mine. I'm just the one making sure he finally faces the consequences. Clarissa, you need to decide right now who you want to be. Because when the sun comes up, you're either standing with them or you're standing with your daughter. There is no middle ground anymore." She hung up without answering. Arthur stared at the phone, wondering if she would ever find the courage to break free from her parents' shadow. He doubted it, but it didn't matter. Maya would be free, and that was the mission. He went upstairs to check on his daughter. She was sleeping peacefully, tucked into the same bed he had slept in as a boy. Tomorrow would be the storm. Tomorrow the Vances would fall. January 2nd began not with a sunrise, but with the buzzing of a phone. Arthur reached for it on the nightstand of his childhood home. It was Tony Farley. "Arthur, turn on the news. Now!" Arthur grabbed the remote, the screen flickering to life on a local news channel. The headline scrolling across the bottom sent a jolt of electricity through him. FBI and state investigators raid Vance estate. The footage was chaotic. Blue and yellow windbreakers swarmed the manicured lawns of the Vance mansion. There, in the center of the frame, was Gregory Vance. He wasn't the polished, untouchable titan Arthur had known. He was in his silk bathrobe, looking stunned and disoriented as he was led to a black SUV in handcuffs. Behind him, Diane Vance was screaming at reporters, her face twisted in a mixture of fury and terror. Boxes of documents were being carried out of the house and loaded into evidence vans. The news anchors were breathless as they reported that Vance Development Group was under investigation for a systematic, 15-year pattern of fraud and corruption. They mentioned anonymous tips and whistleblowers who had provided a treasure trove of documentation. In another part of the city, Warren Stone, the building inspector, was also being arrested at his home. Arthur watched the screen with a grim sense of satisfaction. The trap hadn't just sprung. It had crushed everything in its path. His phone rang again. It was Erin Hickey. "The safe deposit box was a gold mine, Arthur," she said. her voice sounding triumphant. Gregory kept everything: contracts, payment records, even photos of his victims. It's like he wanted a trophy room for his crimes. She told him they had found the original contracts from Elias Sterling's project before they were altered, along with emails between Gregory and Stone planning the sabotage. We found records for 3 other contractors he destroyed the same way, Aaron continued. They'll be able to file civil suits now. The Vances are going to be buried in litigation for the rest of their lives. She estimated that Gregory was looking at 25 years, and Diane would likely face at least 10 as an accessory. Arthur felt a small hand tugging at his shirt. He looked down to see Maya standing there, her eyes wide as she watched her grandfather being loaded into a police car on the television. Is that Grandpa Gregory? Why is he in handcuffs? She asked softly. Arthur turned off the TV and sat her down. Because he did bad things for a very long time, Maya. And now he has to answer for them. He explained that sometimes people think they can get away with being mean or dishonest because they have money, but eventually the truth catches up. Did you make this happen, Dad? She asked. I helped, Arthur admitted. I gave the police the information they needed to catch him. Maya processed this for a long time. Is Mom sad? Probably, Arthur said. He's still her father. It's complicated, baby, but you need to know that we're safe now. I promise. Arthur let out a short, bitter laugh. The same parents who left a note calling their own granddaughter a responsibility and a burden? Those are the people you're listening to. He didn't wait for her to fumble through an excuse. We're done arguing. Maya stays with me. If you want to see her, you can come here. But she isn't setting foot in that house until we have a legal custody arrangement in writing. You can't do this, Clarissa snapped. You're deploying in 2 months. You can't take care of her. Watch me, Arthur said, his grip tightening on the phone. I'll resign my commission if I have to. Maya comes first. Every time. The visit to Oakmont Street. At 7:15 p.m., the doorbell rang. Arthur checked the new security camera he'd installed that morning and saw Clarissa standing on the porch, alone. He opened the door, and for a moment, he saw the woman he'd once loved beneath the expensive clothes and the tired shadows under her eyes. Can I see her? She asked softly. Arthur stepped aside and called for Maya. The little girl emerged from her room, walking slowly. She hugged her mother, but the embrace was stiff and hesitant, the kind of hug a child gives a stranger. Hi, Mom, she said quietly. I'm so sorry about Christmas. Baby? Clarissa said, her voice trembling as she held Maya tight. It was wrong. I should have been here. Why weren't you? Maya asked. The simple question seemed to hang in the air like a physical weight. Clarissa looked at Arthur, then back at her daughter. Because I made a mistake. I let Grandma and Grandpa convince me you'd be fine. Are you going to make the same mistake again? Maya asked, her voice firm. I don't know, sweetie. I'm trying to figure things out, Clarissa whispered. Dad knows what's right, Maya said simply. He came for me. He always comes. Arthur suggested Maya go back to her room so he and Clarissa could talk privately on the porch. The night was freezing, and frost was already beginning to bloom on the windows. My parents are furious, Clarissa said, her breath hitching in the cold air. They have lawyers ready to sue you for full custody. They have the money to make this very ugly, Arthur. Let them try, Arthur replied. I'm done pretending your parents are good people. They're cruel, they're manipulative, and they destroy people for profit. That's not true. They're just particular about success, Clarissa argued, though she sounded like she was trying to convince herself more than him. They destroyed my father, Clarissa, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, deadly calm. He watched her face go pale as he told her the basic facts. How Gregory Vance had sabotaged Elias Sterling's business, forced him into a fatal heart attack, and then bought his land for pennies. That can't be right, she whispered, shaking her head. My father wouldn't. Your father is a predator, Arthur interrupted. And he's been doing it for years. I just found the proof. Now you need to decide who you are. Are you going to be like them, or are you going to be better? Because there is no middle ground anymore. Clarissa didn't answer. She looked broken as she walked back to her car and drove away. Arthur watched her go, feeling a flicker of pity, but he knew she was still drinking her parents' poison. At 9 p.m., the Vances began their annual New Year's Eve gala. It was a massive display of power and wealth, with politicians and business leaders filling their estate. Arthur tucked Maya into bed, kissed her forehead, and told her to dream about good things. Then he drove to the Vance estate and parked down the street. He wasn't there to make a scene. He was there to observe. At 9:45 p.m., he saw exactly what he was looking for. Gregory Vance stepped out onto a second-story balcony with a cigar, looking smug and self-satisfied. Standing next to him was Warren Stone, the building inspector. The two men laughed, and right there in the open, Gregory handed Stone a thick envelope. Arthur raised his phone and snapped a series of high-resolution, time-stamped photos. It was the final nail in the coffin. He returned to his car and called Aaron Hickey, the state investigator. I'm sending you photos of Gregory Vance bribing a city official tonight, he said. I also have the location of the safe deposit box, Box 447 at First Union. I believe it contains 15 years of his crimes. This is incredible, Aaron said, her voice sharp with professional excitement. If this pans out, he's going down for a long time. Meet me tomorrow, January 1st at noon, Arthur instructed. Bring a warrant for that box, and I'll give you everything else you need to bury him. And Aaron, do it publicly. I want him to feel what it's like to lose everything. Arthur drove back to the Oakmont house, his hands steady on the wheel. The trap was set. He sat in his father's old recliner, looking at the photos on the wall as the first of the midnight fireworks began to explode over the city. Happy New Year, you bastards, he whispered. It's going to be your last good one. January 1st dawned gray and bitingly cold. Arthur stood by the window of the Oakmont house, watching the first light of the New Year crawl across the frost-covered yard. He didn't feel the usual sense of a fresh start. He felt the grim focus of a soldier entering the final phase of a mission. After making breakfast for Maya, another morning of quiet conversation to shield her from the coming storm, he called Barb, the kind woman from the hotel. She had agreed to watch Maya for a few hours, sensing that Arthur had urgent business to attend to. As he dropped Maya off, he could see the concern in her eyes. She was a perceptive child, and she knew her father was wound tight. I'll be back soon, I promise, Arthur said, kneeling to look her in the eye. And when I get back, things are going to be different. Better. He watched her go inside, then drove to a small, quiet coffee shop in South End to meet Aaron Hickey, the state investigator. Aaron arrived looking like she hadn't slept much more than Arthur had. She sat down with a digital recorder and a thick legal pad, her expression all business. Without a word, Arthur began pulling files from his bag, copies of the documents from Gregory Vance's office, Tony's investigative reports, the detailed financial mapping from Dennis Harmon, and the high-resolution photos of the bribe he'd captured just hours before. For 2 hours, they sat in that corner booth. Aaron's hands actually shook as she reviewed the materials. My God, she whispered, her eyes scanning a ledger that detailed a decade of payoffs. This is significantly bigger than the convention center. It's a systematic, 15-year pattern of organized fraud and public corruption. Can you prosecute? Arthur asked. Your grandfather Elias's house, he replied. The one on Oakmont Street. I've been working on it, and it's finally ready for us. It wasn't entirely true. The house still needed a massive amount of work, but it was a sterling home, and that made it a fortress in Arthur's eyes. They arrived at the marital home to find it exactly as they had left it. Dark and empty. The Vances weren't due back from their island getaway until New Year's Eve. Arthur and Maya moved through the house with military efficiency, packing her clothes, her favorite books, and her most cherished toys. Before they left, Arthur walked into the kitchen and placed a single note on the pristine marble counter. Maya is with me. She is safe, happy, and loved, things she wasn't when you left her alone for 3 days. If you want to discuss her future, call my lawyer. If you want to be her mother again, you know where to find us. Arthur. He left the business card for Clifford Byers right next to the note. They spent the evening at the Oakmont Street house. It was a modest place with peeling paint and a furnace that rattled like a bag of bolts. But it had a real yard and a garage where Arthur's father had once taught him how to fix an engine. As Arthur stood in the driveway, he felt a strange sense of peace, as if Elias Sterling were standing right there with a hand on his shoulder. I'm going to finish this, Dad, he whispered into the night. The smoking gun. While Maya explored her new bedroom, Arthur's phone buzzed. It was Tony Farley. Arthur, tell me you're sitting down, Tony said, his voice crackling with excitement. I've got something better than good. I've got something beautiful. Tony explained that Gregory Vance wasn't just a dirty developer. He was remarkably arrogant. He had been using the same offshore accounts and shell corporations for 15 years, assuming he was untouchable. But the real breakthrough was Warren Stone, the building inspector who had sabotaged Arthur's father. Stone is still on the city payroll, Tony revealed, and he's still in Vance's pocket. I've got photos from 3 weeks ago of Stone meeting with one of Vance's project managers. An envelope was exchanged. The project? The new downtown convention center. Arthur's pulse quickened. That's federal money, Tony. That makes it an FBI matter. Exactly, Tony said. It's RICO territory now. But here's the kicker. Gregory has a safe deposit box at First Union Bank. Box 447. My contact says the timing of his visits is always right after he acquires a new property. He's a trophy hunter, Arthur. I bet everything I own that he keeps records of his conquests in that box. Arthur leaned against the kitchen counter, a slow, cold smile spreading across his face. Get me the bank's security schedule and the guard rotations, he instructed. I'll handle the rest. Later that night, Arthur found Maya in his old childhood bedroom. She was looking at a framed photo of Arthur as a young boy, sitting on his father Elias's shoulders. Is this Grandpa Elias? She asked. Yeah, that's him, Arthur said, kneeling beside her. Grandma Diane always said the Sterlings were poor and didn't matter, Maya whispered. But Grandpa looks happy in this picture. Happier than Grandpa Gregory ever looks. Money doesn't make people happy, baby, Arthur said softly. Love does. Family does. Your Grandpa Elias didn't have much, but he loved big. He built things with his own hands, and he was honest. He took a breath, deciding it was time for the truth. The Vances hurt him because they could. That's why we found those papers. So I could make sure they never hurt anyone else again. Are you going to be mean to them? Maya asked solemnly. No, Arthur replied. I'm going to be smart. I'm going to show everyone who they really are and let them face the consequences of their own actions. Sometimes, that's the best kind of justice. Maya nodded, seemingly satisfied. I think Grandpa Elias would like that. The midnight offensive. After Maya was asleep, Arthur spread his evidence out on the dining room table. It was a massive web of corruption spanning 15 years, involving dozens of victims and millions of dollars. At the center of it all were Gregory and Diane Vance, safe in their wealth, or so they thought. It was December 30th, 11:47 p.m. In 25 hours, the Vances would land in Charlotte, expecting to return to their perfect, untouchable lives. Arthur opened his laptop and began typing 3 critical emails. The first was to Aaron Hickey, the state investigator. Subject: everything you need to prosecute Gregory Vance. He attached the evidence of the 15-year fraud pattern and the information about the safe deposit box. He made his terms clear. He would cooperate fully, but he wanted official documentation of his help to ensure he kept primary custody of Maya. The second was an anonymous tip to the city building department. He included the photos Tony had taken of Warren Stone accepting the bribe, ensuring the bureaucrat's downfall was already in motion. The third was to Oliver Hunter, the investigative journalist Tony had mentioned. If you want the story of the decade, meet me on January 2nd, the message read. Arthur closed his laptop. Every message was a thread in a trap. Tomorrow he would spend one last day of peace with Maya. And then, when the Vances arrived on New Year's Eve, he would pull the strings tight and watch their empire crumble. "I'm coming for you," he whispered to the empty room. "And you're going to wish you'd never heard the name Sterling." New Year's Eve morning arrived with a cold, pale sun. Arthur spent the early hours in the kitchen of the Oakmont house, making breakfast for Maya. He made pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse, her favorite, trying to keep things as normal as possible while his mind cataloged every step of the day's operation. They ate together, and Maya chattered about her friends and starting school again, carefully avoiding any mention of the Vances returning. At noon, the phone rang. It was Clarissa. Her voice was sharp and clipped, the sound of someone who had spent the last several hours being coached by her parents. "Arthur, we need to talk. We're back tonight, and I saw your note. You had no right to take Maya without telling me." "I had every right," Arthur said, his voice flat and neutral. "I'm her father. And unlike you, I didn't abandon her for 3 days during Christmas." "I didn't abandon her." Clarissa's voice rose an octave. "She was in her own home. She had food and shelter. My parents invited me on a family trip, Arthur. It was supposed to be a chance to relax. Maya is family, Clarissa. Or did you forget that?" Arthur countered. There was a long silence on the other end. When she spoke again, her tone was colder. "My parents said you'd make this difficult. They said you'd use Maya as a weapon against us." On the way, they made a stop at a large Target. Arthur watched Maya as she walked through the holiday aisles. At first, she was hesitant, her eyes darting around as if waiting for someone to tell her she was being too loud or asking for too much. But as Arthur handed her a shopping basket and told her to pick out any tree she wanted, the light in her eyes returned. She chose a modest artificial tree and a box of purple and silver ornaments. Arthur didn't stop there. He filled the cart with things she actually needed: a high-quality winter coat, sturdy boots, and things she simply deserved, like new art supplies and a stack of adventure books. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was setting. They spent Christmas Eve together in a way Arthur hadn't experienced in years. There was no tension, no snide remarks from the Vances about the quality of the food, and no cold silence from Clarissa. They decorated the tree together while a playlist of old carols played in the background. They made thick hot chocolate with too many marshmallows and stayed up late watching old movies until Maya eventually fell asleep on the sofa, her head resting on Arthur's lap. As he carried her to bed, Arthur stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her breathe. He thought about all the Christmases the Vances had likely ruined for her with their demands for perfection and their conditional affection. He realized then that his marriage hadn't just been failing. It had been a prison for both of them. He whispered a silent promise to the sleeping girl, "Never again." Later that night, his phone buzzed. It was an encrypted file from Tony Farley. It was a preliminary dossier on Gregory Vance, and the contents were even more damning than the portfolio Maya had found. It wasn't just corporate sabotage. It was a decades-long history of criminal behavior. Tony had uncovered failed business partnerships that ended in mysterious fires at properties Gregory later acquired for a pittance. There were allegations of bribery involving city zoning boards that had never quite made it to court. But the most interesting piece of information was about a current investigation. It seemed the state attorney general's office had been looking into Gregory Vance for bid rigging on a major public project downtown. The investigation had stalled recently, but the lead investigator, a woman named Erin Hickey, was still quietly digging for the smoking gun that could connect Gregory to the bribes. Arthur stared at the screen, a grim smile forming on his face. He didn't just have the smoking gun. He had the whole armory. Christmas morning was a revelation. Maya opened her gifts with a sense of genuine joy that Arthur hadn't seen at the stifling Vance family gatherings. Later, they went outside and built their promised snowman. It was a bit lopsided, with a carrot nose that tilted to the left and a scarf that kept blowing away. But Maya declared it the best snowman ever built in North Carolina. They spent the rest of the day playing board games and talking about everything and nothing. As evening fell and they sat by the fire, Maya became quiet. "Dad?" she asked softly. "Are you and Mom getting a divorce?" Arthur was caught off guard by the bluntness of the question. "Why do you ask that, sweetheart?" "Because she doesn't love you anymore." "I can tell," Maya said with a matter-of-fact tone that was far too wise for an 8-year-old. "And you're always sad when you're around her." "I don't want you to be sad." Arthur pulled her close, his heart aching for the burden she had been carrying. "Whatever happens with your mom and me, Maya, you need to know one thing. I will always be your father. I will always protect you, and I will always come for you when you need me. That is the one thing in this world that will never change. Do you understand?" "I understand," she whispered. She paused, then added, "Dad, I'm glad it's just us for Christmas. This is better." While Maya slept that night, Arthur went back to work. Information was flowing in from his team now. Tony was providing the grit, Dennis Harmon was mapping the money through shell corporations, and Clifford Byers had located 3 former employees of Vance Development who were willing to talk about Gregory's illegal practices, as long as they remained anonymous for now. Finally, Arthur made the call he had been preparing for. He reached Aaron Hickey, the state investigator Tony had mentioned. He introduced himself as someone with intimate knowledge of Vance Development's internal operations. "I've been trying to nail Gregory Vance for 2 years, Aaron said, her voice sounding exhausted over the phone. "If you have solid evidence, I'm all ears." "I have more than evidence," Arthur replied. "I have a gift-wrapped case that spans 15 years. But I need something from you first." "What's that?" "When this goes down, I need protection for my daughter. Gregory Vance will try to use her in the custody battle to hurt me. He'll claim I'm an unfit parent because of my deployments. I need official documentation that I am cooperating with law enforcement. Proof that I'm the good guy here." There was a long pause on the other end. "Are you the good guy, Captain Sterling?" "I'm a father protecting his child from people who abandoned her on Christmas," Arthur said firmly. "You tell me." "Send me a sample of what you have," Aaron said. "If it's as good as you say, we'll talk about a formal arrangement." Arthur sent a carefully selected portion of the files Maya had found, enough to prove a pattern of fraud, but not enough to give away his entire hand. He knew how the Vances operated, and he wasn't about to give up all his leverage until he was certain Maya was safe. If the state attorney general wanted Gregory Vance, they were going to have to help Arthur save his daughter first. On December 29th, the peaceful mountain air was replaced by the low hum of the highway as Arthur and Maya drove back toward Charlotte. Maya was uncharacteristically quiet, her gaze fixed out the window as the familiar skyline began to appear. Arthur could sense her dread. She was expecting to be returned to that cold, hollow mansion, back to the indifference of her mother and the silent judgment of the Vances. "We aren't going back there, Maya," Arthur said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension. "We're going to get your things, and then we're moving into a new place. Somewhere that belongs just to us." "Where?" she asked, her voice small. Arthur stood up, his resolve hardening into steel. He called the front desk and spoke to the night manager, a kind woman named Barb who had already noticed his military bearing. She promised to sit in the hallway outside his room and keep an eye on Maya while he was gone. "You go take care of your business, Captain," Barb said softly as he stepped into the hall. "That baby girl isn't going anywhere." Arthur nodded, the weight of the portfolio under his arm feeling like a loaded weapon. The Vances thought they had pushed him out of his own life, They thought they could claim his daughter as a burden and walk away unscathed. They were about to learn that Arthur Sterling didn't just survive missions, he completed them. The neon sign of the IHOP on Independence Boulevard flickered, casting a rhythmic blue light over the empty parking lot. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and maple syrup, a comforting, mundane scent that stood in stark contrast to the heavy documents Arthur carried under his arm. He spotted Tony Farley in a corner booth, tucked away from the windows. Tony hadn't changed much since their days in the sandbox. He was still built like a linebacker, with shoulders that seemed too wide for the plastic bench, and he was still wearing his trademark aviators even though it was well past midnight. Arthur slid into the opposite side of the booth and pushed the leather portfolio across the sticky table. Tony didn't say a word at first. He just worked a piece of peppermint gum between his teeth and began to flip through the pages. As he reached the section detailing the sabotage of Elias Sterling's business, he let out a low, long whistle. "Vance? Gregory Vance?" Tony muttered, finally looking up. "Jesus, Arthur. You didn't just marry into a wealthy family. You married into a snake pit, assessing the enemy." Tony tapped his finger on the photograph of the building inspector, Warren Stone. "I know of this guy. Gregory Vance has a reputation in this city, though it's mostly whispered in backrooms. He's a dirty developer with enough connected politicians and offshore accounts to make almost any problem disappear." He looked at Arthur squarely. "This stuff you found? It's dynamite. But Arthur, look at the dates. This is 15 years old. The statute of limitations on criminal fraud in North Carolina is 10 years. He leaned back, the leather of the booth creaking. "If you're planning a standard lawsuit, Gregory's lawyers will bury you in motions until you're broke and gray. It'll take years." "I'm not looking for a courtroom, Tony," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "I'm looking for leverage. I want to know everything about him. Business, personal, criminal. Every skeleton he's ever hidden." Tony's grin was sharp. "Now you're speaking my language. I assume time is a factor." "They're back from the Maldives on New Year's Eve," Arthur replied. "I want the trap set before they even touch down at the airport." "That's tight, but it's doable," Tony said, already pulling out his phone. "I've got contacts who specialize in deep background, but it won't be cheap. We're talking professional-grade digging." "I've got savings," Arthur said without hesitation. "My deployment money, sitting there, and I'm using it to protect my daughter. Gregory and Diane Vance abandoned an 8-year-old child on Christmas. They destroyed my father, and they've spent the last decade poisoning my marriage. I guarantee they've left a trail of other victims just like Elias." The Resistance Network. Tony watched his old friend for a moment, measuring the ironclad resolve in Arthur's eyes. "Okay, give me 3 days. I'll call in every favor I've got." He paused, his expression softening slightly. "What about Clarissa? Is she part of the target list?" Arthur looked out the window at the dark street. "I don't know yet. Right now, I'm focused on the architects of this mess, Gregory and Diane. The rest of the pieces will fall where they may." Tony started listing names, people who had been trampled by the Vance machine over the years. A journalist who had been silenced while investigating construction fraud. A former city councilman who lost his career after opposing a Vance development. Another contractor who had been bankrupted under circumstances nearly identical to Elias Sterling's. Each name was another thread in the web Arthur was weaving. By the time they finished, the sun was beginning to threaten the horizon. A different kind of Christmas. When Arthur returned to the hotel, he found Barb, the night manager, sitting in a chair outside his room as promised. She gave him a tired but kind smile. "She's a sweetheart, Captain. Reminds me of my own granddaughter. You take care of her, you hear?" "I will, Barb." "Thank you," Arthur said, meaning it. He stepped inside the quiet room and found Maya awake, sitting up in bed and watching cartoons with the volume turned low. She scrambled into his lap the moment he sat down. Is everything okay, Dad? It's going to be, baby, Arthur said, smoothing her hair back. I've been thinking, how would you like to spend Christmas with just me? We could head to the mountains, find a cabin, and make it our own thing. Maya's eyes widened, and for the first time in a long time, the shadows in them seemed to lift. Really? We don't have to wait for Mom or Grandma and Grandpa. The fact that she sounded relieved to avoid them hit Arthur like a physical blow. No waiting. We leave today. We'll have a Christmas that's better than anything they could have planned. Can we build a snowman? She asked, her voice finally sounding like an 8-year-old's again. We'll build the biggest snowman North Carolina has ever seen, Arthur promised. As he held her, Arthur made a silent vow. He wasn't just going to protect her. He was going to show her what a real family looked like. Not the twisted, conditional version the Vances practiced, where love was a currency and loyalty was bought. He was going to honor the legacy of Elias Sterling, the man who had built things with his hands and loved his family with his whole heart before the Vances tried to erase him. The war was coming, but for now he had a snowman to build. The next morning, Arthur and Maya checked out of the hotel before the sun had even fully cleared the horizon. The air in Charlotte was crisp, but as they drove west toward the Blue Ridge Mountains, the temperature began to drop and the sky turned a brilliant, clear blue. Arthur had spent the previous night on his laptop, scouring rental sites until he found exactly what they needed. A secluded cabin just outside of Boone. It was remote, peaceful, and featured a massive stone fireplace with a view of the snow-dusted peaks that looked like something off a postcard. At the very bottom was the most damning piece of all. A handwritten note from Gregory Vance to his accountant, dated 3 months after Elias's death. Sterling property secured at auction. Demolition starts next month. This land is perfect for our new shopping complex. Make sure the liquidation covers our entry costs. We got it for a steal. They hadn't just outcompete his father. They had hunted him, sabotaged him, and then picked over his bones once he was gone. And then, years later, Arthur had met Clarissa Vance at a charity gala, never knowing that her father was the man who had destroyed his family. Arthur started to laugh. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a dark, jagged chuckle that made Maya look at him with worried eyes. He smoothed her hair back, his expression turning into one of grim determination. It's okay, baby. You did so good. You have no idea how much this helps. His father-in-law thought he was just a dumb grunt, someone to be patronized and pushed aside. Gregory Vance thought he had one, that he could treat Arthur's daughter like trash and live in luxury on the money he had stolen from a dead man. But Gregory Vance was about to learn a very painful lesson. He was about to learn what happens when you wrong a man who has spent 15 years learning how to plan, how to wait, and how to strike with surgical precision. Arthur stood up, his mind already racing with the first steps of a counteroffensive. Maya, pack a bag. We're leaving this house. We're going to a hotel, we're ordering the biggest room service dinner they have, and we're going to watch movies all night. Tomorrow, we're going to have ourselves a real Christmas. And after that, I'm going to go to work. Maya's face lit up. Deal, she said. As they walked out the door, Arthur didn't look back. The Hoffmans, no, the Vances, had no idea who was coming for them. They thought they were the predators, but Arthur Sterling was the one who knew how to hunt. The hotel room was bathed in the soft, warm glow of the bedside lamp. Maya was finally asleep, curled up under the heavy-down comforter with her worn-out stuffed rabbit clutched tightly against her chest. For the first time in days, her breathing was slow and even, free from the tension that had gripped her in that cold, empty house. Arthur sat at the small wooden desk in the corner, the leather portfolio spread out before him like a battlefield map. He wasn't just a father anymore. He was a captain in the middle of an operation, and he needed a team. The assembly of the team. Arthur pulled out a legal pad and began to write. He wasn't making a list of evidence yet. He already had plenty of that. He was making a list of people. To take down an empire like the Vance Development Group, he needed specialists who could operate in the shadows where Gregory Vance lived. Tony Farley, his old squad mate from his first tour. Tony had left the military years ago and built a reputation as one of the most effective private investigators in the state. More importantly, Tony owed him his life. Arthur had pulled him out of a crumbling building in Kandahar when the world was ending around them. Tony was the man who could find the dirt no one else could see. Clifford Byers, a sharp, relentless attorney Arthur had assisted during a local crisis. Clifford had deep roots in the legal community and wasn't intimidated by the old money families that ran the city. He knew how to navigate the courts like a chess master. Dennis Harmon, a forensic accountant who had married Arthur's cousin. Dennis was a genius with numbers. He could trace a single dollar through 100 shell corporations and find exactly where it was being hidden. The Vance pattern of destruction. Before Arthur made a single call, he needed to see the full scope of the enemy. He opened his laptop and began a deep dive into the history of Vance Development Group. As the hours ticked by, his blood ran cold, but his smile only grew wider. What he found was a systematic trail of wreckage. Gregory Vance hadn't just gotten lucky with Arthur's father. He had built his entire fortune on the same predatory tactics. Over the last 15 years, the company had acquired 17 different properties through highly suspicious means. The pattern was identical every time. A small contractor would be hired, mysterious violations would be found by a building inspector, the project would be sabotaged, and then Gregory would buy the land for pennies on the dollar once the contractor went bankrupt. It wasn't just business. It was a criminal enterprise disguised as a development firm. The poison in the marriage. Looking at the documents, Arthur finally understood how his own life had been dismantled. He remembered meeting Clarissa at a charity gala for wounded veterans years ago. She had been 23, beautiful, and seemed genuinely interested in his life outside the military. For their first date, she'd left her expensive jewelry at home and played miniature golf in jeans, telling him how much she hated the suffocating expectations of her elite family. Arthur had believed her. He thought she wanted something real, something outside the Vance bubble. But the pressure from her parents, Gregory and Diane, had been a slow, constant drip of poison. Every Sunday dinner was a lesson in his inadequacy. They made casual, cutting remarks about his military salary, questioned the stability of a life in base housing, and constantly whispered that Clarissa deserved better than a man who was always deployed. The final breaking point had come 8 months ago when Arthur's mother passed away. She had left him the small house on Oakmont Street, the only thing his father had managed to save from the Vance's greed. It was modest and needed work, but it was paid for and it was home. "We are not moving into some rundown neighborhood, Arthur," Clarissa had snapped when he suggested they renovate it. "Think about Maya's schools. Think about our reputation." "Our reputation? Or your father's?" Arthur had countered. The fight that followed was the worst they'd ever had. She had called him selfish for wanting to keep his father's legacy alive. He had called her a puppet of her parents' greed. That night, he had slept in his truck. By the time he returned the next morning, Clarissa had already called her father, and Gregory had arrived with a team of lawyers. They didn't file for divorce immediately, but the separation was cold and final. Arthur was relegated to the guest room during his leaves, a stranger in a house he was paying for, while the Vances continued to hollow out his marriage from the inside. The line in the sand. He looked over at Maya, who was still sleeping soundly. He had tried so hard to protect her from the poison in their family, but he realized now that he had failed. She had been treated like an inconvenience, an afterthought to a vacation in the Maldives. Arthur checked his watch. It was late, but he knew Tony Farley would be awake. He sent a short, encrypted message. 5 minutes later, his phone buzzed. "Tony, I'm at the IHOP on Independence. Bring the files. Let's go to work." The December wind felt like a serrated blade against Arthur Sterling's skin as he stood on the front porch of the house that used to be his sanctuary. It was late, and the streetlights of the quiet neighborhood cast long, flickering shadows across the frost-covered lawn. Arthur was a captain in the army, a man who had seen the harshest environments on Earth. But nothing chilled him quite like the sight of his own home looking so lifeless. There were no colorful lights strung up, no wreaths on the door, and no signs that a family was preparing for Christmas. It was as if the holiday had simply bypassed this address entirely. Arthur had driven 18 hours straight from Fort Liberty. He'd burned through his emergency leave because of a single phone call with his 8-year-old daughter, Maya. Her voice had been wrong. Not the usual high-pitched excitement of a child waiting for Santa, but something quiet, careful, and hollow. It was the voice of a child trying to sound like an adult, and it had set off every alarm bell in Arthur's military-trained mind. Something was very wrong at home, and he wasn't going to wait for a scheduled leave to find out what it was. He tried the front door, half expecting it to be locked, but the handle turned easily. He stepped inside, and the silence was immediate and heavy. The air felt stale, and the heater was barely running. As his boots thudded against the hardwood floor, he noticed several expensive-looking boxes stacked near the garage door, with designer luggage tags still dangling from the handles. The kitchen was eerily clean, looking more like a showroom than a place where people lived and ate. Then he saw her. Maya was sitting cross-legged on the floor in the living room. Next to her was a bare Christmas tree, still stuck in its plastic stand but completely devoid of ornaments or lights. She was wearing a purple sweater, the one Arthur had mailed to her from his last deployment, and her dark hair was tied back in a messy ponytail that she had clearly tried to do herself. There were no presents, no cookies, and no warmth. Just a little girl sitting in the dark, waiting for someone to notice she existed. "Maya," Arthur whispered. She jumped up, her eyes wide, and let out a small cry before sprinting into his arms. Arthur caught her, lifting her up and holding her tight. She was so light, and her small body was trembling as she buried her face in the crook of his neck. "Hey, baby girl, I'm here. I'm right here," he murmured, his heart breaking as he felt the dampness of her tears on his uniform. He carried her over to the sofa and sat down, keeping her tucked against his side. "Where's your mother, Maya? Where is everyone?" He tried to keep his voice steady, but the anger was already starting to simmer beneath the surface. Maya pulled back, and Arthur saw a look in her eyes that no 8-year-old should ever have, a weary, knowing look of someone who had been let down too many times. Without saying a word, she reached into the pocket of her sweater and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was high-end stationery, cream-colored with embossed edges. Arthur recognized it immediately. His mother-in-law, Diane Vance, was obsessed with looking distinguished. He opened it and read the sharp, elegant handwriting. "Arthur, we decided to spend the holidays at our private villa in the Maldives. Maya is your responsibility now. We will discuss permanent arrangements regarding the house and custody when we return in the new year. The key is under the mat if you need it. Do not bother calling, our phones will be off." It was signed simply, Diane. Arthur read it once, then twice. His jaw tightened so hard it ached. "When did they leave, Maya?" 3 days ago, she said, her voice small but steady. "Mom said you probably wouldn't show up anyway, so they should go ahead and enjoy the trip. Grandma Diane said I could stay here by myself or go to the neighbors if I got scared. She said I was old enough to handle it." She twisted her hands in her lap. "I wasn't scared, Dad. I know how to lock the doors. I even know how to call the police if I have to." Arthur pulled her back into a hug, a wave of pure fury washing over him. The Vances, his wife's wealthy, social-climbing parents, had always treated him like a grunt who wasn't good enough for their daughter, Clarissa. But he never imagined they would be cruel enough to abandon their own granddaughter on Christmas. "Did they at least leave you food?" "There's stuff in the freezer," Maya replied, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "I made some mac and cheese yesterday. I'm okay, Dad. I'm just glad you're here." Then, she pulled away again, her eyes shining with a different kind of intensity. "I found something, Dad. Something they were hiding." She wiggled off the couch and ran upstairs. Arthur heard her small footsteps heading toward the master bedroom. He knew Clarissa had been sleeping there alone during his recent leaves, having relegated him to the guest room months ago. When Maya returned, she was lugging a heavy leather portfolio, the kind lawyers use for important contracts. The brass clasp was broken, and it looked like Maya had used a screwdriver or a kitchen knife to force it open. "They were all packing," Maya explained, breathless. Grandpa Gregory was yelling at Mom about some paperwork, and Grandma was busy in her room. I went into Grandpa's office to use the bathroom, and I saw this in his desk drawer. It wasn't even locked. I think he forgot he left it there. She opened the portfolio and laid it out on the coffee table. Arthur's hands began to shake as he looked at the very first page. It was a contract, but his eyes were drawn to the signature at the bottom. It was his father's name, Elias Sterling. The document was dated 15 years ago, just 6 months before Elias had passed away from a massive heart attack brought on by the stress of losing his business. Elias had been a small-time contractor, a man who built honest homes for honest people. He had been proud of his work, but his final project had ended in disaster. The client had sued him for faulty work, the bank had pulled his loans, and Elias had lost everything. Arthur had been 19 at the time, freshly deployed, and he had come home just in time to bury his old man. As Arthur flipped through the pages of the portfolio, the truth began to emerge like a nightmare. This wasn't just a contract. It was a roadmap of a corporate execution. There were amendments added after his father had signed, impossible material requirements, and compressed timelines, all designed to make sure his father's bid failed. Even worse, there were printed emails showing Gregory Vance coordinating with a city building inspector named Warren Stone. They had planned the failures. They had paid Stone to fail the inspections at the most critical moments.